Hey adapters, welcome back. Joining me today is Dr. Samuel Goodwin. Sam earned his doctorate in chemical engineering from the University of Colorado at Boulder. While in graduate school, Dr. Goodwin completed fellowships at the National Academy of Science and the U.S. Department of Defense. Climate change is a comprehensive problem requiring an integrated solution to be properly addressed. Sam will discuss how to construct a solid foundation for decision making when designing our response to this challenge. He presents guiding policies necessary for building a renewable power grid, sequestering carbon, and marshaling societal resources. Hey, Sam, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're going to be talking about whole of society strategies. These are these big issues that I love talking about, and I think you took a crack at this with your book. Let me make sure I get it right. Beyond Carbon Neutral, How We Fix the Climate Crisis Now. We're going to dive into that, but briefly, what's the book about?
Sure. So, broadly, the book is my attempt to lay out what a comprehensive strategy for addressing climate change might look like. So, it starts off at the beginning, what we'll be discussing here today, the guiding principles that you use to make your decisions as you go through that entire process. Then it dives deeply in three critical areas: how we can rebuild our power grid, how we can take carbon out of the atmosphere to return us to normal, and really how we can use different societal institutions to accomplish both of those goals effectively.
Okay, writing a book is not an easy thing, especially around a technical issue like climate change. What inspired you to write a book?
Well, this is basically my attempt to get a bunch of thoughts that have been kicking around inside my head onto paper. So I've been working on this in the background for the past couple of years, taking some notes here and there. I ride the metro during normal times into DC, which gives you a lot of time to think when you're not, trying to avoid being crushed in the rush hour hustle. But really, it was the pandemic and being forced to work from home that gave me an extra 2 hours a day where I could just sit down and hammer it out and put pen to paper.
Okay, so what has the response been? So you've put that out there. These are your ideas, and there's a lot of people thinking about climate change right now. But so what have people said to you?
So far, the response has been pretty positive overall. People have appreciated that I've dived into, actually what these solutions might look like instead of talking about it at a high level. I don't really focus about the urgency of it. I'm assuming, if you're interested in climate change, this is a very pressing issue that we have to deal with. And there are other books that lay out that case in, extraordinary detail. So I really wanted to focus on what are the solutions, how do you construct those, and people have generally resonated with that and they appreciate it because it does show that there is a path forward for ultimately reversing the problem.
All right, I am very fortunate that I get to talk to a lot of interesting people, a lot of startups working on the issue of sequestering carbon. And one of the things that comes up a lot, and a lot of these are new technologies, but the idea of it being scalable do you talk about that in your book? How we have things that can sequester carbon, but scaling that is always the issue.
Yeah, scaling is the fundamental issue whenever you're talking about any kind of artificial capture mechanism, whether it's, cryogenic, you're pulling CO2 out and you're making dry ice, whether you have some kind of chemical reaction to pull it out of the air. That's all incredibly energy and capital intensive. So it's natively very hard to scale that, especially because there isn't presently a market force driving someone to do that. So yeah, I completely agree that that's a very tricky problem to deal with.
Okay, well, can you give us what do you think are some of the more exciting technologies that you think might get us there?
So one of the things I try to stay away from in the book, and this is one of my guiding principles, is not to really, speculate too much about the future technology because it's research and development. It might pan out, it might not. We don't know even when that might happen. So I try to focus more on the things that are, we can actually scale really well right now. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of that is non-technological. It's about rebuilding ecosystems, these mangroves, these salt marshes, these forests, these prairies that can sequester way more carbon with a lot less of effort than trying to build up this whole infrastructure right now. So if the technology arrives and that changes, certainly we can make use of that. But I'm not really to commit to any of those right now until I see a little more proof of concept.
All right, so the notion that you have to give up something, and this is, what you've talked about a bit. Can you explain that people out there are like, all right, well, if we're going to address climate change, it's going to be this awful and all these sacrifices, and that's not necessarily the case, right? That's not the message you're trying to give people in this book.
Well, I think the message I'm trying to give out is that there's ways to mitigate those sacrifices somewhat. but it doesn't do some kind of change. So, for example, there's been a lot of movement in Europe about the giving up flying. Air travel contributes a lot to carbon dioxide emissions. So if you want to cut down on your footprint, you decide to fly less. Now, that's a pretty tough proposition in the United States. My wife and I, if we try to visit any of our family over the holidays, that involves a plane trip. So that's a pretty big sacrifice to say you can't fly anymore. So we can instead say, all right, instead of trying to make that very hard sacrifice, what kind of alternatives can we have? How can we make fuels in a more renewable way that are at least net neutral, so you can maintain air travel, or if we can invest in other kind of infrastructure like trains. That's something we have to consider. They all have upfront costs that we have to be willing to bear, but it allows us to maintain our standard of living as much as possible without necessarily having to make those giant sacrifices.
Okay, so you talk about a theory of change, of helping change the political process to address something like climate change. That's a very big kind of concept, but can you kind of briefly explain what the theory of change it hopes to do?
So basically the theory of change is that we won't see the kind of drastic action if we rely on forces coming from the top down. It has to be a bottom-up process. There has to be enough people invested in this to be able to go out and vote and get those specific representatives in our representative democracy who are willing to then make those changes for us on our behalf. And once we have that groundswell in place, then people are on board with that kind of transition we need to make. They're more willing to accommodate these kinds of, if not necessarily sacrifices, at least disruptions in their lives. So we really need to get that critical mass of people on board to be able to change who's operating the levers of power in favor of taking action.
So in some ways, it's almost kind of political recommendations. It's not some technical or whatever, but it's just sort of the idea that, all right, the kind of leadership getting to the point where you're getting those people in place, it's almost an election sort of recommendation.
Well, that's what it comes down to. What I come to the conclusion in the book is that really the federal government is really the only institution in the country that can provide the kind of forcing function to create the necessary change in the timescale we need. So going back to history, you have things like mobilization for World War II, where you completely changed the economy to accomplish this substantial task. Only the government was able to do that. So you need to be able to ensure that the government is on board with the kind of change that you want to have happen.
Have you had an opportunity, because you're recommending these broader societal approaches to dealing with climate change, but look at the Paris Climate Agreement. Do you look at what their approach is? Because a lot of that is a country by country, but do you feel like there's concepts in there that are like, okay, they're on the right path, or is it not necessarily aggressive enough? Have you had a chance to kind of digest what they're hoping to do?
So I think, in theory, the Paris Climate Accord it's a good thing because it shows a general willingness to tackle the problem. It gets a lot of buy-in from a lot of different sectors, at least on paper. The thing that you have to remember about that is that fundamentally, countries are sovereign entities. They can't be necessarily forced to do anything, which is why there aren't a lot of really strict provisions that you can really enforce with the Paris Agreement. So it's really good for setting the baseline, setting the tone of how we want to approach the problem going forward, because it does have to be a global solution, but it doesn't necessarily have those teeth that are really enforceable. We can't go to another country and say, hey, you're violating the Paris Accord, you need to do this. So we just have to keep that in mind as we're designing solutions, that we only have so much power to outside of our own borders to really instigate change.
Okay, so your background, you have a PhD in engineering. And do you think that helped you in writing this book? As an engineer, is my understanding, you have a certain mind. You approach the life in a much different way than maybe the rest of us. How did that help you? And what were some of the issues as you were thinking it? Because there's a lot of books out there on climate change. So a perspective from an engineer is just a different take, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to remember that so I went through a PhD program, and coming out of that, you can actually have a very myopic view because you're graded on how well you can dive incredibly deeply in a very narrow field in a very specific subject. So I did my work on quantum dots and nanomaterials, which is incredibly niche and narrow when you're looking at it. So having my engineering training, it made me able to, interact with and interpret technical data, do these kind of evaluations. And going back to undergrad as a chemical engineer, you do kind of price out different options when you're designing a hypothetical chemical plant. But I think what really helped was that after that training, I moved into more of a soft science space, more into the public policy realm, where you see how, okay, there may be a certain amount of data. How do you actually translate that into something useful? We know how to answer the question, but how do we make sure that the question is answered?
All right. So earlier you didn't want to go into making specific recommendations on maybe carbon sequestration, what technologies are really going to succeed. But do you talk about geoengineering in the book? It's more broadly. I mean, some people might equate the two as the same thing. Geoengineering, we're going to carbon sequester, but it really is almost its different topic. Do you talk about that in the book?
I do. So generally, geoengineering kind of comes up with a little bit of a scare quotes around it because it talks about certain things that people are rightly worried about, where if you're trying to drastically change the climate. So what I'm focused on, is presenting solutions that are, scalable and relatively safe. We're taking carbon out of the atmosphere in somewhat of a natural way. So on the more geoengineering front, you have things like ocean fertilization, where you try to add some nutrient to the ocean, encourage algae blooms, the idea that it'll sink to the bottom. The data is quite mixed and, not entirely in recommendation of that approach, which I dive into. Also talking about things like aerosols in the atmosphere and solar mirrors. Those could work. We know they work because volcanoes basically do the same thing, but they're inherently non-permanent solutions, so they don't actually contribute to the ultimate solving of climate change. So I don't necessarily recommend those either. So I do dive into all these different options and whether or not they make sense for a coherent strategy going forward.
Yeah, my own exposure to them, a lot of them just seem like bad ideas because there's so many X factors that you just can't factor in. But I do think in 15, 20, 25 years, our attitude to even have the discussion around geoengineering could change radically. Not that I want that to happen, but I think what remains to be seen of what the temperatures and all that will be like. Okay, on that note, let's talk a little bit about nuclear power. You talk about that in the book too. It can be a divisive topic in the environmental community, but I'm finding less so in the last 5-10 years. It's like all of a sudden it's really kind of pivoted. Like, okay, well, it's a potential energy source, and it's more important than it's the waste issue. So, what do you talk about nuclear power in the book?
So nuclear power, like you said, is a really interesting thing that always get kicked around, and it seems to be somewhat of a litmus test around certain groups or certain discussions. So I tried to approach it as, okay, so we know we can get, carbon-free power by expanding its use. Okay, there are some interesting technologies in the pipeline that could potentially mitigate some of the waste issue. Okay, that's a potential recommender as well. The issue, though, is that just like coal, oil, and natural gas, there's only so much nuclear fuel we can mine out of the ground. So depending on certain estimates, maybe we have centuries left, maybe we have less than that if we increase our usage. But if we keep proliferating nuclear power, we're going to run through that stockpile so much quicker. And then we're left in a situation, whether it's in 50 or 100 years, where we have to rebuild our power grid entirely from scratch anyway with renewables. So I say it's just more efficient to cut out the middleman and go straight to renewables now. Now, that doesn't mean that nuclear power doesn't have a role now. We obviously need to keep it running, or else we'll run into problems like Germany did, where they took it off prematurely and they replaced a lot of that capacity with coal and natural gas instead of the renewables they were investing so heavily in. So we should absolutely keep them running as long as possible, recycle our nuclear fuel, and if some of those new technologies do come up, the synergistic approach that I present in the book is you use all that extra energy to power those very demanding infrastructure that pulls the carbon out of the atmosphere. Because if you run out of fuel, that's fine. The problem's already solved, and we don't have to deal with either one ever again.
All right, so I had mentioned in the introduction about these three guiding policies that I think the book is based around, is this building a renewable power grid, sequestering carbon, and then marshaling societal resources. Can you maybe just give some context of is that like you had talked about the Marshall Plan in the World War II? Like, how do those three guiding policies kind of get started?
Right. So a lot of it is overcoming inertia. So whether that's, societal inaction, whether that's rebuilding the power grid, you have to overcome some kind of inertia that is maintaining the status quo. So with rebuilding the power grid, what form does that take? Well, you have all these fossil fuel power plants that are currently in existence and providing power and providing value. So whether you have, a natural gas burning plant, for example, it has an expected lifespan of 20 to 30 years. So if you want to take that offline and replace it with renewables, basically whoever owns that is going to lose whatever book value is left on that power generating capital. So they have a natural incentive to run that into the ground as long as possible. And if renewables are cheaper when it does decommission, well, then they'll replace it then. But we need to move faster with that. So we need some kind of forcing function to change that kind of economic calculation. Same thing with taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Right now, it's free real estate. You can put as much greenhouse gases up there as you want and really not suffer any of the consequences in terms of having to pay for it. So if you want to start pulling it out, you need some kind of larger forcing function to make people do that. And the way you do that is by using the societal institutions to mandate it. So you have a thing like a clean power plan that says you have to stop having carbon emitting power sources in this certain jurisdiction. It means you have to offset or you have to take carbon out of it. So that's really what I mean by we need to marshal the resource to overcome this hump. Because once you overcome that, basically it's self-sustaining. If you have a power grid based on renewables, well, when they reach the end of their useful life, they're most likely just going to replace them with more renewables.
It seems, and maybe, I don't know if you recommend this in the book, but like a carbon tax itself would be threading all three of those policies together, depending if it's set right and whatever. But here you're raising revenue, and marshaling societal resources and then using the price of carbon and sequestering. Anyway, do you get to the level of recommending something like that kind of policy mechanism?
So I do analyze, what a carbon tax would kind of mean for achieving all of those specific goals. And at the end of it, I don't necessarily really recommend it just because fundamentally it does impact, the poorest among us in society the most. If you're one of the 50% of Americans who don't have $500 in your bank account, you really can't accommodate any additional expenses on your monthly or even weekly budget without running into serious problems. Even if that money is supplied to you at the end of the year in some form of dividend, you're going to be in a pretty sticky situation. So for those reasons, if you're talking about building a coalition of a grassroots group of people who are really able to coalesce around this issue, saying you're going to put them in those kind of dire straits, I don't think is really amenable to building that movement.
All right, let's talk a little bit about adaptation. And so what role does research and innovation play in adaptation? It doesn't get necessarily, it trod at my heart, but like adapting to climate change is, kind of elevating itself as a field. And so what about research and innovation?
So research and innovation is another one of those tough sticking points because it's always brought out as something we should do, or even it should be our sole focus right now, either to bring down costs, to make things more efficient. The problem with research and innovation is that there's no actual requirement to actually use a technology that you develop. So you could create the world's most efficient solar cell, but unless there's some, incentive to actually deploy it and get it out there, it'll just sit on the shelf or sit in the literature. So I really want to get away from focusing on research and development because, it could just delay us from actually getting to that endpoint. If we're waiting for some magic bullet to arrive that's really going to solve all our problems for us, we're going to be waiting forever. And in that same time, we could have actually been deploying the things that work right now that we know will contribute to solving the problem. So I think we just need to get out there and do it.
All right. So thinking about what you recommend in the book, how are we doing out there right now? How is society doing around all these issues on trying to address climate change?
So in some ways we're doing well, and in some ways we are doing not so well. So I think right now there is, this critical mass of awareness that, this is a serious problem. We have to deal with it, especially this summer with all the heat waves, the heat domes, the extreme weather, the forest fires. People do recognize that this is a legitimate problem that we have to deal with. So I think we're past the point where we have to worry about, climate denial being a serious impediment at least among the general population. There's enough people to overcome that now. And we're seeing movement in other sectors. So auto manufacturers have moved to almost exclusively commit to making electric vehicles going forward. That's a pretty big step forward because transportation accounts for a huge amount of annual emissions. So I think, having that kind of foundation and groundwork in place, that's really good in a short period of time. Where we're not doing so good, I think, is really grappling with what kind of, going back to the idea of sacrifices and changes we have to make. So think about the response to the suggestions around alternative meat or cutting down meat consumption. It was pretty harsh and pretty quick because that is a major cultural touchstone. Meat is a major part of American culture. So if you suggest changing that kind of consumption habit, even though it's necessary for dealing with climate change, you're going to get a lot of pushback. So I don't think there's been a lot of grappling with what a complete solution actually means and getting buy-in on that level yet. So I think that's really where we really need to work on.
All right, so as we get to the end of this interview here, a lot of people who might watch this, they think, well, what can an individual do? And you address that, right?
Right. So when I got into writing the book, someone asked me at the outset, okay, what can I do as an individual? And they were really asking, how can I change my consumption habits? Where should I shop? What should I eat? Should I use recyclable bags? Things like that. But the fact of the matter is an individual has negligible impact on the overall progress of climate change. You could be the perfect consumer, the perfect recycler, and it literally won't make any difference in our current trajectory. The only thing that matters is getting enough people on board to create systemic change, to fundamentally change how we operate. So that is the primary focus of individuals, is being willing to support that kind of systemic change and being willing to spread the message about the need for that systemic change and encouraging others to join that outlook and that kind of movement.
All right, so I guess ending it here, we've talked to you. Thank you. This has been a very interesting interview, and congratulations on the book. And who would you recommend for me to talk to on Cimpatico? We talked to a lot of different people, but I want my guests to make some recommendations. So are there any particular people you think that would be likely to come on, and who would be a good interview?
Oh, that is a good question. If you'll allow me, I'll pour through my Rolodex because I know I have people in mind. It's just I can get that to you after the show. I'd be happy to, because I know that there are other people in this space who are fellow authors who I worked with on this. I was doing interviews for this journey, so definitely have some recommendations there that I'll shoot your way.
Yeah, definitely. We were always looking for new voices to talk to here on Cimpatico. So yeah, definitely follow up on that. We'll definitely follow up for sure. Well, Sam, this has been great. Again, this is, the book, hopefully just, more people are going to read it. And is there a book tour or anything planned? I know it's kind of a crazy time right now to do a book tour. Is that in the cards?
Not at the moment, not with COVID still the way it is. Still doing everything virtually. Thankfully, I wrote this book during a time in our history where we have this kind of interconnectivity and availability. So I'm just going to keep going virtually for now.
All right, we'll have links to the book within the web page for this show, and so that people can find it that way. I want to bring you into Just Chatting, so just hold on just a sec, but we're going to wrap this up, and thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.